All right, well, welcome everyone to another Monticello for Kids live stream. We're so glad that you could join us. My name is Laura. I work at Monticello. We'll show you a picture of that beautiful west front. It is the home of Thomas Jefferson. And this week, if you've watched our other live streams with Bill Barker portraying Thomas Jefferson, or with one of our restoration specialists, Lucy Middlefort, you know that we've been talking about architecture this week. This is one of the things that Jefferson loved the most and enjoyed the most, and it's just a really fun and cool thing to study, and there's so much to learn. And Jefferson was a self-taught architect. We're going to do a fun activity today to bring the west front of Monticello to life. So we'll give you a look at the house. And I want to hear from you all, what does an architect do? So you guys tell us in the comments, what does an architect do? It has to do with drawing, collecting ideas, deciding how things are going to work and how they're going to look. And it's definitely a lot of planning. And just like we talked about last week with preserving historic sites, architecture reflects what we like and what we think is important. So Jefferson chose what he liked and what he thought was important for his designs too. So if you have a good definition of what an architect does that you would like to share with us in the comments, please let us know. So what we're going to use today for our architectural designs is actually vegetables. That's why we are back in the kitchen, and we are going to use them as stamps to create our own design of Monticello. So this is what we're going to recreate. I have an old example here on a t-shirt, and then we're going to make it on this tote bag I've got propped up right here. Great definition, design building is exactly right. So decide what they're going to look like, and we'll talk about building those buildings too. So Jefferson designed Monticello his own home, meaning Little Mountain, and he designed several other buildings, and we'll talk about those as well. So we're going to capture Jefferson's design for Monticello with a carrot, a stalk of celery, and 2 potatoes. That's what we're going to do. And we're going to use some paint too. Now we need to get a good idea of Jefferson's designs for Monticello. To do that, he said that the putting up and pulling down of Monticello was one of his favorite amusements. He thought it was fun to continually change his mind about the design of the house. And his first design of the house is pretty different from what we think of now. So this is one of his early drawings for what we call Monticello 1. And we have a great question too. Why did Jefferson keep changing his house? He had new ideas, and he got ideas from a lot of different places, and we're going to talk about that in just a moment. So as he collected these new ideas, he went from this design, which was 2 stories, 8 rooms, and moved to the design we know now as Monticello, or Monticello 2, with 3 stories and 21 rooms. And the biggest change that you see there is a dome on top. So that is going to be our first step in creating our own Monticello. So I'm going to cut one of these potatoes in half lengthwise. I'm going to cut one side flat. And this is a part that you would need a grown-up's help for. But once you've got your stamps, you're good to go. And then I'm going to cut around the top in a curved shape. And we certainly don't want to waste food right now. So once you're done stamping, you can cut off the bits that have gotten food-safe, non-toxic paint on them and still use the rest of the potato. You can compost it, whatever makes sense for your family. So I cut the top in a curve, I cut the bottom flat, and now we have a dome stamp. So I'm going to stick this in some red fabric paint. I'm going to use a popsicle stick to scrape off the extra so I don't have a big blotchy dome. And then I'm going to put it right towards the top in the center of this tote bag right here. All right, we are off and running and getting started here. I would love to hear what you guys like to design. There are so many different things that we can create designs for, so many different things you can design with. You could draw like Jefferson did, but perhaps you're using different materials or different building toys that you enjoy. So we would love to hear about that too. Now, we were talking a little bit earlier about the difference between designing and building. And of course, those who built Jefferson's designs were enslaved people, people who worked without pay or choice for Jefferson, owned by him or owned by others that Jefferson then paid their owners to use their labor. And they were extremely skilled craftsmen. They did everything from level the mountaintop to make space for the home, to make the bricks to make the house out of, to add all of these unique design features that Jefferson was popularizing in the young United States. One of my favorite examples of this is one of the archways called an elliptical archway in Jefferson's library. And this was built by two men, James Dinsmore, who was a hired Irish white craftsman, and John Hemmings, who was an enslaved woodworker who Jefferson owned and had trained by James Dinsmore to do all of this fancy woodwork at Monticello. And then John Hemmings did much of the woodwork later on at another design of Jefferson's Poplar Forest. And it took these two men 12 days to build this arch together. Can you imagine that? They didn't have power tools or calculators, but it's a perfectly symmetrical, beautiful, detailed arch. And that's really cool to think about. Now, we were thinking and asking earlier, where did Jefferson get all of these ideas? Many of them came from books. I mentioned Jefferson was a self-taught architect. And the key books that he was using were written by Andrea Palladio. And he wrote 4 books that were kind of like a catalog of all of the different architectural features that were popular in ancient Greece and Rome. We have one designer using Legos and Lincoln logs and magnetiles, all of the greats. So many options in there. I love that. So here's a look at some of the books that Jefferson was studying with. So lots of great details in there and lots of rules about what classical architecture should look like. And that means that to capture the classical architecture of Monticello, we're going to need a pediment. This stamp is even easier to cut. So I'm going to cut straight across the bottom again. That scrap I can definitely save and make French fries out of later. And then we're going to cut this piece into triangles. So I'm going to pick sort of a center point at the top and aim for it for both sides so I get a nice even triangle. A little skinnier. There we go. Gotta get that nice point in there. And I'm gonna get some more red paint on this. There we go. And I'm gonna leave a little bit of space under the dome and put this down right there. Great, there we go. So we've got books as a source of ideas, and then also travel. Jefferson got to go to France as one of our ambassadors and traveled around England and elsewhere in Europe while he was overseas. And then he also came up with ideas just by trying. That's the idea behind putting up and pulling down, right? Is you can always try something new in your designs. So next we are going to add some windows, and this is easiest of all and least wasteful of all, because if I was about to cook with this carrot, I'd definitely cut off this end that's gotten a little gross anyways. And that's going to give me a perfect circular stamp to make some little yellow windows. So I'm going to put one on each side in this gap I've left right here. And then one of the window designs in Monticello is called a lunette because it looks like a crescent moon, part of a moon. So a little moon is kind of how that translates. And that I can use the top of a celery stalk that I would cut off before cooking with it anyways too. So very easy. And now I've got a perfect half moon shape to make that window out of. And that's going to get a little bit of yellow paint too. Just dab off the extra there, and that goes right on top of the pediment underneath the dome. Perfect. So now we've perfectly captured those dome room windows of Monticello. So as Jefferson was traveling and reading, he was thinking about a few different key places. He was studying ancient Greece and Rome, and I used the word classical earlier. That's where that word comes from. So you can take a look at the Pantheon and also see a pediment and columns and all of these other ideas that Jefferson was using for Monticello and his other designs. So I think that means we need some columns for our Monticello. So I'm going to take another potato. I made sure to buy a long one for this. It does feel kind of silly to buy vegetables based on their shape. So I'm going to cut off a side here so that I don't use too much of it. And then I'm going to cut it so that it has straight edges. Make it rectangular. And then I'm going to cut it down the middle so it's not too thick. All right. Some more red paint here. It is nice to use a tall piece of potato so that you don't stick your fingers in the red paint. I always end up a little messy when we do this activity. All right, and then under the pediment, I'm gonna put 4 columns. Another place that Jefferson was studying architectural ideas was in France while he was living there. And that was where he learned how to actually have his dome built, learned about the engineering for that design. Oh, I need to stamp a little bit harder. But if it doesn't come out perfect, that's part of what makes it fun and interesting, so that it turns out unique to you. All right, so now we've captured those classical columns. So the next piece of our design is done. And then of course, Jefferson was using some ideas from England as well, from the styles of buildings that he had grown up with and learned about in his family history and that he'd also seen on his travels. And he certainly used a lot of those ideas for his gardens too. So not just architecture for buildings, but architecture for landscapes too. That's an important type of design to think about. I'm gonna put some more red paint on this piece, and it's going to be perfect for stamping our walls, as well as a step at the bottom of our columns here. So I'm going to stamp those on while we take a look at some of Jefferson's other architectural designs. So Jefferson was so busy at Monticello once he retired from being president that it was actually too crowded for him to be there all the time. He just didn't like being constantly surrounded by all of those people coming to meet him because he was so famous. So he built and designed a second home on another piece of family land out near Lynchburg, Virginia, called Poplar Forest. And because this was a home just for him and his family to enjoy, he could really experiment with this one. So the whole house at Monticello is in the shape of an octagon, another classical shape that Jefferson loved because it left no dark corners, lots of light and lots of windows. Because remember, they did not have electricity in Jefferson's lifetime. So that way they could have lots of natural light throughout the day. And then also while Jefferson was retired, he was working on designing a school that we've talked about before. Jefferson designed the buildings of the academical village, as he called it, at the University of Virginia. So here he wanted the buildings to become a teaching tool. Back then, it was even more expensive to travel around the world than it is now. And so he knew that many of his students would never get to go to Greece or Rome to see these ancient buildings, and they didn't have photographs the way we do now. So he built the structures of or had the structures of UVA built, excuse me, in a design so that they could learn from the architecture of the school itself in addition to what they were learning inside. And then Jefferson also, and so here's one of Jefferson's drawings for the university. And you can see this is much more precise than his drawing for Monticello. And that's because in this case, he had to get funding from the state because it was a public school. And so he had to calculate out everything that was going to go into these building designs. And he even calculated how many bricks would be needed for the building of the school. And then Jefferson also designed the Virginia State Capitol, where the legislature meets in Richmond, Virginia. And it, again, meets those neoclassical designs, but he didn't experiment as much when it came to UVA or the state capitol because he wanted to follow the rules and set those good examples of architecture. Whereas in his homes and those personal projects, he could experiment as much as he wanted. So just as we were talking about with the design for Poplar Forest, we need to make sure that there's lots of light in our design for Monticello. So I'm going to use one of these scraps from one of our earlier stamps and cut a piece, another rectangle that is, let's see, a little shorter than that so it fits inside the walls, but nice and wide so we have nice big windows. Yep, that'll fit. And I'm going to stamp another 4 yellow windows into Monticello. Monticello has many more windows than 4, but this is what will fit on our design, right? Now, if you guys have any questions for us, we would love to hear them and answer them. Or if you have answers to our earlier questions, we would still love to hear those responses and share them with you all. There's a lot more things that you can learn about Jefferson and architecture on our website. We'll put up the link to the instructions for this activity for you, and you can do it at home. You can do it with really, I bet you can get really creative with what vegetables you use for this and what you stamp it onto, as long as you have permission from a grown-up to stamp it, right? We're not going to go crazy. And then there's also a great lesson plan where you can dig into all of the math required to design these buildings, all of the math that went into the scale of the columns on the east front. You can design your own Monticello virtually. That's a great online game that we'll put up for you. And then if you look back in our Facebook feed, you'll also see a fun video where you can act out the styles of columns from Ionic to Doric to Corinthian. So a lot of fun activities to be had there too. All right, we have finished off our design of Monticello. I've got a piece of extra foam core inside of this so the paint doesn't bleed through and stick to itself. But there we go. There is our design. We are happy to go back and answer any questions you have for us later. But thank you all so much for joining us. And have fun creating your own Monticello-inspired designs.